Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here in such a rainy day. Today, we have our guest, Dr. Şima İmşir, with us, and we are thankful that she accepted our invitation, and she will be with us for the next hour. So, Şima İmşir holds a PhD from University of Manchester. She's an assistant professor in comparative literature at Koç University. Her teaching and research ranges from medical and health humanities, illness and literature, to comparative modernisms, gender, and post-colonial studies. She has published numerous journal articles and book chapters on women writers, health, and illness. Her monograph, and the topic of today, Health, Literature, and Women in 20th-Century Turkey, Bodies of Exception, is published as a part of the Routledge Studies in Literature and Health Humanities series in 2023. Today, Dr. İmşir will talk about what she refers to as bodies of exception, the sick bodies of the national collective and their literary constructions. I will thank again Dr. İmşir for being here and leave the word and floor to her. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pakujam, and thank you very much for inviting me and also coming here to listen to my talk or connecting on Zoom. In 2021, when the pandemic was still going on and when Albert Camus' The Plague was still a popular choice, one novel that came out in Turkey was about hospitals, was not about COVID, pandemics or diseases, but it was on precarious position of women. This novel was Ülker Abla by Seray Şahiner. The plot goes like this. Ülker Abla, a woman who has been a victim of domestic violence for years, finally plots her escape from her husband with a decision to hide in a hospital as a non-recorded caretaker. In the world of Ülker Abla, female caretakers and patients form a non-spoken agreement. Each looks after each other in a world of dependencies. The road from the wedding center, where Ülker Abla sometimes visits, pretending to be a guest at the wedding so that she can eat the wedding cake, drink a glass of lemonade, and dance without a care, to the hospital across the street, where the bride is eventually taken due to domestic violence, is a short one. The hospital becomes a space where precarity of women's bodies becomes tangible. The novel also points to the hospital as a space where medicine is more than a round that takes doctors as its focus. While doctors, of course, are fundamental, medicine and the experience of illness includes many other active agents: nurses, professional and non-professional caretakers, pharmacists, the person who brings us our food, the person who cleans the patient's room, all play important roles once we are ill. The novel presents us a critique of the system, but it also reminds us that healing, being a patient, and the experience of being sick is beyond medicine as a positive science. That cousin of ours who stays with us when we are ill might end up having a more focal place in our experience when we are physically suffering. We also often don't consider ourselves as our own caretakers, but we too play an important role here. We are oftentimes our own primary caretakers. Very broadly, I am now defining the field of research area that names itself health humanities. The field of research makes a claim beyond the claims of medical humanities. Both suggest that, yes, medicine cannot be taught without humanities. From the diagnosis to the language used by doctors, or the ways in which diseases are represented in cultural imagination, health is and will always be a political and ideological issue. Health humanities takes a step further and also suggests that the role of other agents in medicine, such as the ambulance paramedic, the pharmacist, the nurse who takes our blood, all play a role that go beyond the doctor-patient relationship. When I, of course, talk about being ill, I am not talking about diseases, but illnesses, the way we experience them. A differentiation between the two words was famously first put forward by Arthur Kleinman in his 1988 work, The Illness Narratives, Suffering, Healing, and the Human Condition. Here, he explains the difference as follows. By invoking the term illness, I mean to conjure up the innately human experience of symptoms and suffering. Illness refers to how the sick person and the members of the family or wider social network pursue, live with, and respond to symptoms and disability. Illness is the lived experience of monitoring bodily process, such as respiratory diseases, abdominal cramps, stuffed sinuses, or painful joints. One of the things we find in illness as an experience is transformed understanding of time as a parenthesis time. Illness is the other life, when we have responsibilities and suggest that, I am sorry, but I'm going to be in a hospital on that day. The unspoken agreement is that nobody will expect us to complete that task on that day. We are excused. We are in the other time, parenthesis time, a time of waiting. We are now in a time of exception. Today, I will talk about my book, which I have named Health, Literature, and Women in 20th Century Turkey, but it also has a subtitle, Bodies of Exception. This I borrow and paraphrase from Giorgio Agamben's State of Exception. In Agamben's writing, we find the notion of exception as an invisible border that the norm relies on. In other words, if I will decide on what is inside the norm, I will also need to decide what is outside the norm, what exception is. For inside is only possible with the understanding of outside. Agamben uses this notion while discussing the figure of Homo sacer and differentiates bios and zoe. The merging of the two is what makes us modern subjects. We are politicized animals. In Homo sacer, Giorgio Agamben argues that zoe, which expressed, I quote, the simple fact of living common to all living beings, animals, man, or gods, unquote, and bios, I quote, the form or way of living proper to an individual or a group, unquote, were combined at the threshold of the modern era. It is in his writing that we find the modern dilemma of the bios of zoe that relies strictly on the ban on bare life. He writes, there is politics because man is the living being who, in language, separates and opposes himself to his own bare life, and at the same time maintains himself in relation to that bare life in an inclusive exclusion. In other words, bare life or pure life lies at the center of politics through exclusion. But let me ask, why exactly considering inclusive exclusion is important to understand when it comes to medicine? In 2013, in one speech among many, then Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan demanded women produce, I quote, at least 3 children to keep the numbers of our young population high, end quote. Now, of course, there is much to talk about this from many angles, but putting aside criticism towards such gender politics, one question that we can also ask is, what if I cannot give birth to any children simply because of my health? This is a question that we can follow up with many others. Does the fact that I cannot give birth to children make me unfit? Unfit for what? If I am medically unfit to give birth, does this make me unfit as a citizen? In my incapability of giving birth, do I become simply a bad citizen? These questions were my starting points in my research. I am primarily interested in how certain illnesses and the notion of unhealthiness are constructed and become parts of cultural imagination through representations. I examine how illnesses such as tuberculosis and cancer were represented in the literary imagination of 20th century Turkey by specifically following the image of the sick woman. Novels, consequently, lie at the center of this book due to the central position they played at the outset of Turkish modernization from Tanzimat period and due to their function as an artistic medium in which representations of health and illness were explored, reflected, further developed, detested, or all of the above. My work asks, what about unhealthy bodies? Does being sick mean failing as a citizen? And what did literature do with this? I argue that we find medicine as one of the defining tools of Turkish modernity since the 19th century. And therefore, if Turkish modernity as a project presented health as one of the main conditions of being an ideal citizen, it is then possible to create an alternative history of modernity by looking at what it excludes. And secondly, how these potentialities manifest themselves in fiction presents us with a portrait of how discourse on health shaped the imagination of periods. I should make clear that I am not approaching literary works as historical archive materials. However, as many scholars such as Terry Eagleton or Raymond Williams remind us, one cannot force politics into literature since it is always already there. I approach literary works as active participants in the discussion rather than representations or mirrors of the ideology. If works of literature are spaces where ideologies of bodies are contested or produced, or all at the same time. Here, I investigate the ideological dynamics behind such negations and scrutinize the dominant discourse regarding bodies in 20th century Turkey in women writers' works. What I am concerned with, therefore, is not material, corporeal unhealthiness, that is, diseases themselves, but how they become part of a discourse, how they have been imagined and narrativized. While in my research, I specifically focus on 20th century, in order to have a detailed understanding of the politics of medicine in Turkish literary imagination, I need to go back to the 19th century. So please bear with me as I give you a rather fast portrayal of the very focal place that medicine played in the 19th century. Shortly before it went through a period of vast modernization through Tanzimat reforms, preventive medicine and centralizing health services became issues to consider for the Ottoman Empire. The military retreat of the period led Sultan Selim III to pay attention to the fitness of the Ottoman soldiers. The first state hospital was founded in 1806. The first quarantines, a word that is very familiar to us today, were put into action under the rule of Sultan Mahmud II. However, as Foucault reminds us, regulation of the bodies is not about death, but it is about utilizing life and human labor. Between 1829 and 1836, the population census and the registration of births and deaths were regulated. From 1827 onwards, the Ottoman Empire systematized its control over abortions with decrees that banned the act or penalized those who assisted abortion. In 1840, Meclis-i Tıbbiye Medical Council was founded to regulate medical products. By the turn of the century, worries over syphilis had led to the publication of books, both in translation and originally written in Ottoman Turkish, to be distributed to warn the public about the dangers of the disease, with writers such as Ahmet Mithat, İbnül Hakim Mehmet Tahir, or Melikzade Fuat, strongly arguing that full health checks should now be preconditions of marriages. In other words, worries over diseases developed alongside concerns regarding the structure and system of the Ottoman Empire. In the meantime, science and positivism were seen as tools to create a new Ottoman society. What we had, therefore, was a new type, doctor of society, or social doctor, as the savior figure. German materialist Ludwig Buchner, French physiologist Claude Bernard, and later Charles Darwin, among many others, became influential names and were often cited to explain society in light of science and positivism. Medicine was one of the key areas where these new epistemological notions were introduced and applied. Medical measures were introduced through the Foreign Ministry and then followed by the Ministry of Interior. However, as Halis Akdar notes, they were not taken to, I quote, seek good public health as an end in itself, but as a tool for the Ottoman reformers' immediate political, national security and economic welfare aims, end quote. Doctors from Vienna, the UK, France responded to the invitation from the Ottoman Empire to take up positions as instructors in these medical schools. Many members of the intelligentsia began to see themselves as social engineers. The Society of Union and Progress first came to existence at the Royal Medical Academy in 1889. The first founding members were the students of Mehmet Shakir Pasha, who was a professor at the Royal Medical Academy, and he was also a former student of Claude Bernard himself, a name we will also remember from Émile Zola's long essay titled Experimental Writing, where he builds on his understanding of naturalism in literature almost entirely on Bernard. One of the nucleus members of the Society of Union and Progress, Dr. Abdullah Cevdet, translated Gustave Le Bon's Psychology of Peoples in 1907 and wrote in the introduction, I translated this book with the aim of showing the anatomy and physiology of nations to those who want to be social doctors of nation and play leading roles in social matters. As Tuba Demirci notes in her PhD dissertation, Body, Disease and Late Ottoman Empire, in this period, Ottoman ahali, masses, inhabitants, turned into a population. In Ernst Kantorovic's The King's Two Bodies, a study in medieval political theology, he points to two bodies of the king. There is the human body of the king who eats, sleeps, ages, gets sick, and dies. There is also the human body of the, there is also another body of the king, Kantorovich argues, and that one is immortal, all-powerful. Once the mortal body dies, the immortal body moves to the next king as echoed by the cries, the king is dead, long live the king. Eric Santner in Royal Remains takes Kantorovic's argument and puts it in the theory of nations. He argues, with the emergence of nations, the undying symbolic body was passed down to the members of the nation. You, as an individual, can die, but nations live. Long live the nation. Suddenly, individuals' bodies became valuable sources of the nation. With the foundation of Turkey as a nation state, hand in hand with research on the history, linguistics, and anthropology, medicine was a powerful ideological tool. The new Turkey had very clear-cut definitions on who an ideal new Turkish citizen was. The official speeches in the government and publications by the founding members defined this individual as healthy and fit, among many other things. Remaining healthy and taking care of one's body were defined as the primary duties of every citizen. Such expectations, of course, took different courses in different genders. Women, for instance, especially had to make sure that they were healthy, since they were expected to give birth to and raise healthy young generations. For instance, in a weekly newspaper called Yeni Adam, New Man, in 1937, İsmail Hakkı Baltacıoğlu explained the role of the new woman as follows. The new woman also brings about the idea of a new body, not a coquettish, fragile, sickly beauty, but a strong, healthy, athletic, fresh beauty that is indicative of success. It was hence important for the new woman to engage in sports, as the head of the Wrestling Federation, Ahmet Fetkevi, wrote. One of the biggest facts that all the world accepts is that a sturdy child can only be born from a strong and healthy mother. Such discourse bestowed every individual body with, to quote Foucault, a biological responsibility. Mendelian genetics, especially concerning the hereditary laws on mixed races, as argued in Mendel's experiments in plant hybridization, inspired the works of Mazhar Osman, Şevket Aziz Kansu, and Sara Aktik, three of the most respected scientists of their time in planning the welfare of the future generations. Perihan Çambel and Sadi Irmak utilized Francis Galton and Jean-Baptiste Lamarck's ideas to scientifically support the hereditary qualities of the Turkish nation, as well as to use genetics as a determinant while regulating populations. While scientists use this research to justify the natural capacity of the Turkish people to be modern, some of these scientists also held important positions in the parliament, allowing them to enact laws in accordance with the results of their research. Among these scientist MPs were Cemil Topuzlu, two-time mayor of Istanbul and a surgeon, both nationally and internationally known, and Fahrettin Kerim Gökay, the mayor and governor of Istanbul. Hence, healthiness and fitness were turned into measures for the members of the nation to size themselves up against, and they identified them as prerequisites of inclusion in the nation. Accordingly, in the first National Medicine Congress in 1925, Prime Minister İsmet İnönü referred to healthy man as the primary condition for the financial and social betterment of the country, as well as a guarantee for national defense. Similarly, Fahrettin Kerim Gökay remarked in 1931 that, I quote, one for all for one, end quote, and suggested that, I quote, today an individual is the most income generated source of capital, end quote, in his The Issue of Eugenic and Sturdiness of Race. In 1930, Mazhar Osman wrote that the increase of working healthy hands was positively correlated with the wealth of the country. In 1941, he formulated the definition of a good citizen and wrote, I quote, a person proves that he's a good citizen by protecting his life, end quote. A professor of Istanbul University, Fahri Arer, gave a speech entitled Street Accidents as part of government's conference series, in which he suggested that knowing what to do in case of an accident helped create importance since, I quote, what use is a child to himself or his country if he loses his legs? He is doomed to live as a parasite on the back of society, and society is doomed to feed him, unquote. Now I'd like to go back to Agamben in order to discuss what such discourse would mean for the nation. In the first volume on Homo Sacer, Agamben's first argument is this. The original political ban, a relation is the ban, the state of exception, a zone of indistinction between outside and inside, exclusion and inclusion. I would like to place this argument on state power into the private sphere of individuation and suggest that the ban is a form of objection. In her Powers of Horror, Julia Kristeva defines object as something that is neither object nor subject. including but also excluding both. The in-between position of the object disturbs the borders of subjectivity and culture by threatening the integrity of the subjection that is necessary for the formation of identity. She writes, it is thus not lack of cleanliness or health that causes objection, but what disturbs identity, system, order, what does not respect borders, positions, rules. Like the subject that imagines nation suffers from the same threat against its borders. Agamben's second thesis is this. The fundamental activity of sovereign power is the production of bare life as originary political elements and as threshold of articulation between nature, culture, zoe, and bios. The second thesis implies that politics is a biopolitics from the very beginning, and that every attempt to find political liberties in the rights of citizens is therefore in vain. Additionally, with its capacity to be unwell, the material body functions as a reminder of the man as its object. The borders of the nation relies on what is left outside of it. Here, it is my argument that when the national collective is defined in terms of its health, and its members are defined as being born with a hereditary strength, fitness, and health, such conditioning automatically endows individuals with a biological debt for the greater good of the collective, and strips the unhealthy ones of the discursive membership of the community, reducing them to bare lives. The close-knit tie between the meanings attributed to bodies and investments on human lives, and therefore between medicine and ideology, are inevitably reflected by literary works. My focus in my research is specifically on women authors and how they depict sickly bodies of their female characters, since women's bodies were very specifically defined by the Republican ideology as the guarantors of future generations. One of the points I have discovered throughout my research was how different genres of literature were predominantly instrumentalizing different illnesses. For instance, Heidegg's works discuss bodies in the dichotomy between individual versus society. In Mevlüt, published in 1917 and 18, being unfaithful to your wife is not just a matter of personal or familial issue. Through syphilis, it makes an impact on the future society. According to the doctor protagonist of the novel, Kasım Şinasi, there was no power like family, occupation, or willpower to inhibit this addiction. Here the narrator means alcoholism and venereal diseases spread by unfaithful husbands. This was a racial disease. The country was darkened and burnt by this debauchery that was a nest of filthy diseases that had rotted the race. An Anatolian boy who spent his entire life suffering from poverty would waste his modest fortune on cards in coffee houses or on rakı, while sons of pashas or young masters would waste all their money and health in Beyoğlu. Here, anxieties pertaining to the future of the empire are additionally embodied in the image of the wife suffering from syphilis and the child. But at the same time, women and children with their patient but dark eyes were silently spreading the poison and the disaster of debauchery diseases to the race. In order to have a more detailed understanding of Heidegg's working brain in Mevlüt, a novel where she heavily utilizes syphilis, we must go back to her influences and where such questioning comes from. For this task, she makes the first step of our job easy. She dedicates the novel to a writer no other than Émile Zola himself. It is, however, not just dedicated to Zola. It is dedicated to the soul of Émile Zola. Now, I would like to attempt to understand what the spirit of Zola would mean. As is well known, Émile Zola, the champion of naturalism, at this point had already become an object of interest among Ottoman intellectuals. Referred to as the first Ottoman naturalist, Beşir Fuad himself, for instance, had championed Claude Bernard's experimental medicine along with Zola's naturalism. Yet Zola's definition of writers as experimental scientists and his choices of topic were also criticized by many other prominent writers of the period, like Ahmet Mithat Efendi. Ahmet Mithat criticized Zola's subject materials, for instance, in his essay, Emil Zola'yı neden okumuyorum? Why don't I read Emil Zola? Halit Ziya Uşaklıgil, on the other hand, asks in his hikaye, the Goncourts are also realists, but in spite of this, their work is not filthy. There is filth in Zola. Why? He then moves on to respond to his own question by suggesting that this is not the fault of the author, but of reality. While he does not deny the existence of subject matter in Zola's works, he compares a realist novelist to a scientist and researcher examining society, and suggests that their findings should not elicit disgust, for, I quote, even the most disgusting fact is more valuable than the most ornamented fantasy, end quote. According to her memoir, Halide first discovered Zola in 1901. Her memoir is full of comments on her struggle with Zola. She defines him, I quote, as the most powerful educator of her soul, end quote, an idealist who, I quote, attacked man's vices, exaggerating into absolute folly the sexual ones, end quote. Zola, on the other hand, had rather conflicting opinions on idealism. He, for instance, criticized idealism in his own essay, The Experimental Novel, published in 1880. In this work, where he theorizes his naturalism, he condemns idealists for being entrapped in themselves in search of truth, and describes himself instead as a man of science, a magistrate who has the capacity to enlighten science about the motivations of human behavior through what he calls the experimental novels. He writes, I quote, "It is scientific investigation, it is experimental reasoning, which combats one by one the hypotheses of the idealists, and which replaces purely imaginary novels by novels of observation and experiments," end quote. Halide's notes on Zola, however, in Halide's notes on Zola, however, we have a rather spiritualized picture of Zola. In her memoir, she writes, I quote, "Zola lighted up portions of the human soul with his fastidious and very French idealism. He chastised man by making grotesque statues and pictures of their vileness," end quote. Such sexual desires was accordingly stopping mankind from reaching a higher level. For she suggests, I quote, "Zola evidently taught that the sexual perversions were fundamental ones in man's character, and that unless he were made sane and normal in that respect, he could not reach higher levels," end quote. Zola's test, she says, is the hardest test for sincere and piously inclined souls. But if they can come out of it whole, nothing afterward can change their belief in the existence of a divine power, end quote. What was this test again? She explains, "I always identify Zola with a picture of Christ chasing the moneylenders from the temple. I do not remember whose the picture is, but in it, Christ has the unrelenting eyes of a destroyer, full of a holy horror, such horror as Pasteur would have had in his eyes if he had seen a tube of microbes of some terrible sort getting loose in a human dwelling." Now, let's go back to that diagnostic paragraph in Mevlüt'üm. This diagnosis is in line with the medical discourse of the period, in which Ottoman neuropsychiatrists were already beginning to use the word degeneration as a defining term. For instance, Mahsar Osman in 1915 gave a lecture entitled "Türkler Mütereddimi, are Turks degenerates," in which he mentioned hereditary qualities as determining the present and future of society. Edip was up to date with contemporary debates on syphilis as a social problem. To consolidate the connections between her fiction and the real-life debates concerning syphilis, she makes her character, Sarah, who suffers from the disease, read every publication by Celalettin Muhtar, one of the leading experts on venereal diseases and dermatology of his time. One of Muhtar's published books was the translation of Alfred Fournier's Syphilis and Marriage, which repeatedly highlights the social dangers and causes of the disease. The novel echoes scientific debates on venereal diseases of the period, which directed blame at a new type of man. In Seçil Yılmaz's words, these men were described as, I quote, "unscrupulous, indifferent, and ignorant," whose illicit sexual adventures with prostitutes transmitted syphilis to unwitting wives and children, end quote. Such men, as Seçil Yılmaz notes, I quote, "were understood to damage the physical bodies of innocent women and the social body of the Ottoman Empire." From chauvinism of the members of the upper class to burdens of the working class and unfaithfulness of husbands, medical language in Halide's Mevlüt'üm is used to diagnose the ills of society. Through the form of the novel too, however, Halide manages to show doubt also at the intentions of the doctor as a savior figure. The narrative focalizes on his mind in order to step-by-step diagnose individuals and society alike. However, gradually, the main character, Kasım Şinasi, loses his objectivity as he too becomes a victim of his own individualistic passions. Like Zola's Nana, this novel too ends with the death of Sarah. However, unlike Nana, Sarah does not die due to syphilis, but is murdered by her doctor husband, who convinces himself that Sarah is being unfaithful to him, and this must be a sign of her advanced syphilis. The scene reminds us the ending of Othello. It casts doubt on the purely scientific mind, but also redeems Sarah by showing us her true qualities. It is discussed by many Halide Edip scholars, such as Hülya'da. Halide Edip's body of works focuses on the ideal woman and what this woman should be like. This image functions as a normative and regulative ideal in defining women's behaviors. I argue that health is also a fundamental part of such formulation. In this respect, Halide Edip's body of works can be perceived as a portrait gallery of embodied spirits who redefine the regulative woman over and over again in accordance with nation-making ideology, as they are transformed from fragile romantic heroines in sick chambers to healthy and fit daughters of the Republic. In a later novel, published in 1939, Tatarcı, the definitions of the protagonist Lale as the best swimmer of the town focus on her fitness. She embodies the ideal young woman, not just with her ideals to become a teacher, but also in her healthy and sporty body. In this novel, the model of sickly beauty is defined as something that of the past. The new nation finds its future expression in the healthy bodies of its youth. I would like to discuss one more author whose works are also aligned by romanticization of illnesses in popular culture. If we will talk about the representations of health and illness in women writers' works in Turkish, we cannot quite forget this name, a figure who is defined as the queen of tuberculosis, Kerime Nadir, and of course, melodramas. Melodramas are highly important in terms of the intersection between medicine, literature, and ideology. Melodrama as a genre, more than anything else, relies heavily on heightened meanings of physical gestures, and it is an important arena to scrutinize the patterned meanings of bodies. In these works, a gaze is never just a gaze, and a cough symbolizes something bigger than itself. As Peter Brooks writes in his famous The Melodramatic Imagination, I quote, "The melodramatic body is a body seized with meaning," end quote. Melodramatic mode, Brooks writes, brings forth hyperbole and heightened gestures. Suggesting that melodrama is a product of modernity, Brooks follows the roots of the genre to the French Revolution and its aftermath, and argues that in a period when the strong positions of church and monarch were dethroned, when what was perceived as sacred was shattered, and the hierarchical balance of society was shaken, melodrama was born almost to bring back the needed, transgressive, sacred back into the lives of the people. Aligned with Brooks, in Çatışma ve Müzakere, Conflict and Negotiation, Turkish and Armenian Modern Dramatic Literatures in the Ottoman Empire, Mehmet Fatih Uslu argues that the first melodramas by Ottoman playwrights represented the morals of the French Revolution at the beginning of the century. According to Uslu, the villains of the story symbolize the old traditions, and I quote, "The attack on the love of the young couple was an attack on this demand for change," end quote. Melodramas allowed writers to transmit their political message and also allowed the audience to identify with melodramatic courage and tragedy in a period of unrest. In the first half of the 20th century in Turkey, melodramas also gained high popularity with the public, produced by writers such as Kerime Nadir, Muazzez Tahsin Berkan, and Esat Mahmut Karakurt. These texts narrated love stories of the upper class, but they did not carry overt political agendas in the first look. As argued by scholars such as Reyhan Tutumlu and Ömer Türkeş, these works often depicted the new lifestyle of elites, teaching the masses the new social decorum of the country. They did not carry out political agendas. Nonetheless, they were products of their very own historical moment. In 1938, only 15 years after the foundation of the modern Turkish Republic, a young writer called Kerime Nadir published a novel about the tragic love story between tubercular Nalan and a young soldier Kenan. The novel was titled Hıçkırık, meaning sobbing, and it immediately became a bestseller, causing the following generations naming their children after the characters of the novel. I like to argue that Hıçkırık is a novel that shows the anxiety brought about by the rapid social change, revolution in everyday life, and presents clear-cut definitions on new women and new men by utilizing illness as a sign of necessary sacrifice by women to create the moral occult for the heroes to regain their power and find their moral balance. Hıçkırık, sobbing, is also a Bildungsroman as much as it is a love story. Kenan, an orphan, is adopted by Nalan's father when he's 6 years old, and the narrative follows his growth. Franco Moretti suggests that the process of normalization defines the main characteristic of Bildungsroman. As Meltem Güle writes, Moretti's sense of normalization is very much in line with Hegel's phenomenology, according to which I develops by being a member of we. For Moretti, the normalization of a hero is where the hero does not only obey the social norms, but thoroughly internalizes them. He calls this comfort of civilization. Bildungsroman is one of the closest meeting points of the private and the social. The growth of the hero, according to a given timeline, fits within the progressive ideology of modernity and presents the hero as a symbol of modern man. In his Unseasonable Youth, Jed Etsy touches on what is left undiscovered in Moretti's formulation in The Way of the World, the symbolic function of nationhood. I quote, "The discourse of nationhood supplies a realist Bildungsroman with an emergent language of historical continuity or social identity amid the rapid and sweeping changes of industrialization," end quote. It is therefore highly significant that in 1938, in the heyday of Turkish Republic's ideology of progression, Kerime Nadir chose to write about the becoming of a hero with the given timeline. In the scene where Kenan and Nalan first meet, the power hierarchy in their relationship is established immediately. Feeling shy in front of Nalan's friends, Kenan hides himself behind Nalan's skirt. Nalan directly adopts the role of an older sister as well as a mother replacement, and the two grow up as siblings. Kenan's brotherly, or rather son-like love for Nalan turns into a romantic one as they become teenagers. However, no matter how many years pass, Nalan still defines Kenan as childish and immature. To paraphrase Homi Baba, Kenan is almost a man, but not quite. In the introduction to the new edition of the novel, Selim İleri notes that he always reads Hıçkırık as a story of Kenan's repressed sexuality. Accordingly, whenever he's at Nalan's side, Kenan describes his cheeks reddening, his heartbeat accelerating, and tells us that he feels like fainting. Putting his head onto her breast or onto her knees is a repeated action in their daily dynamics. He is at a loss for words and his sense of self whenever his head falls onto Nalan's chest. In his own words, "A feeling of fainting has passed through me as if I was falling from somewhere high. It was the first time I had put my head on Nalan's breast for years. I was half unconscious. My ears were listening to her heartbeats." As one grows up and gains energy, the other loses it. Kenan, step by step, turns into a man as Nalan melts away with tuberculosis, coughing blood. While she defines Kenan's feelings as childish and Kenan as not yet a fully grown man, she defines herself as too unhealthy to unite with such a promising, healthy young man. While early on in the story, Nalan is depicted as a mature young woman and Kenan as an immature young man, later on, Kenan becomes a healthy and strong soldier and Nalan a weak but saintly damsel in distress. She is now, I quote, "the image of alluring sexuality on display, but made passive, subservient, and manageable by illness," unquote. The process is almost completed. Kenan is normalized in Moretti's sense, almost, but not quite. Kenan's love for Nalan does not cease, but rather turns into a sexual obsession as the years pass. His tantrums, caused by sexual frustration, gain power. He tries to rape her, but is stopped by Nalan's coughing and trembling. Kenan's masculine desire to consume Nalan is achieved by Nalan's consumptive disease. The text is not very generous about the dates, except two cases. One of them is the year that Nalan dies, 1912, which also, of course, coincides with the Balkan Wars. After Nalan's death in 1912, Kenan joins the Independence War and finally returns to Istanbul in 1923 with the victorious Turkish troops who were ready to start a brand new country from the ashes of the diseased empire. Kenan is now finally narrated as a fully grown man. If the loss of the empire, as Çimen Günay Erkol notes, was pointing to a crisis in the hegemonic masculinity, Kenan, end quote, Kenan returned from war with his newly gained manhood. What we have, therefore, in Hıçkırık, as a result, is an image of man growing in national historical time. The completion of his transition is rewarded by the text too, when Kenan sees Nalan's daughter, Handan, for the first time. Handan grows up to be an exact lookalike of her mother and replaces her mother. This daughter is defined as a healthier, purer, more innocent and younger version of Nalan, a perfect match for the newly resurrected hero. She looks exactly like her mother. She wears her mother's lilac perfume. And when she decides to be with Kenan, she says, I quote, "The only woman who can make Kenan happy is my mother in me," end quote. Handan, in other words, is a new generation who is capable of breeding a healthy new nation. Tuberculosis is not the only disease that will trigger Kerime Nalder's imagination, however. In 1950, in her rewrite of Hıçkırık, she this time instrumentalizes mythologies and cultural imagination of another illness, cancer. Posta güvercini, carrier pigeon, identifies cancer with another social threat, the growing capitalism. As cancer of posta güvercini replaces consumption of Hıçkırık, the unbalanced economic policies are reflected through the villain's thirst for money. This text marks the capitalist greediness, the hero's sexual desires, and the heroine's illness as untamed and invasive, and demands the recreation of the sacred values. The medical discourse of the period informs these works, with sickly heroines being replaced by their healthy and fit daughters or younger companions. The masculinity crisis is solved through sacrificing women's bodies. Here today, I try to present two textual examples as to how we find illnesses potentially used as metaphors in a tightly knit relationship between medicine and ideology. In my research, taking the risk of looking at a broader timeline, I attempted to understand such uses of illnesses. This attempt brought new questions and realizations. For instance, what happens to bodies after 1960s as gradually as put by Jale Parla in her Türk romanında Yazar ve Başkalaşım, Metamorphosis and Writer in Turkish Novel, the image of physical fragmentation in works produced following the 1960 coup increases as a method of resisting the violence, torture and oppression applied by the state police and military. In works by writers such as Sevim Burak, Aslı Erdoğan, Tezer Özlü, we then find physical body, one that is capable of being sick, one that privileges the touch and the tactile act, resisting and undoing the discursive body. As the official ideology regulates bodies through patriarchal, heteronormative, and ableist discourse, literary works will keep on, and they do keep on, writing back to shatter the borders of so-called ideal bodies. The persistent existence of the carnal body in literary and artistic representation bears witness to the haunting of what is marked as exception. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And also, I mean, both for the engaging and inspiring talk and also for keeping the time very closely. So thank you. I'll open the floor for questions. And as you think about your questions, I can start actually with a broader first question to initiate the discussion. Actually, two. So my first question is, you started kind of opening up how this new area of studies has become popular and what it may offer us, and especially kind of a combination of humanities and medicine. And what you do is mostly from the side of humanities. So I was curious, what does medicine feel towards it? Can we see any reciprocal relation? Does medicine change likewise, both scientifically and also in practices, like the way hospitals are organized, the relationships with sicknesses? Is it still that medical, or does this intervention of humanities change any difference? Is my first question. And second very broad question would be, you talk mostly on female body and women's bodies throughout, and how the ideal citizenship is constructed by this womanhood and mostly the motherhood of womanhood for the next generation. And while listening, I also had in mind how male body was constructed, or how was the story for the man? What did the state or citizenship require them to do to fit in with this new idea of body and fitting in mostly?
Thank you very much, İpek Hocam, for these great questions. From the medical side, so especially medical humanities, as a field, there are now combined programs as well for also people who are studying medicine too. And these programs are encouraging students to also pay attention to the humanities side of things, which is quite interesting because when we think about something like the Hippocrates Oath, the humanities is there right from the very get-go. But of course, the technological advancement on the way, it became something that perhaps made us forget about all this. However, now more and more, of course, with the discussions around bioethics, with these classes that pay attention to humanity. So from the medical side as well, this is, I think, gradually more and more highlighted as something that is needed for the medical education as well. And also it is seen as part of the cure as well. Does that answer the question? And health humanities, on the other hand, really is very new. It's, I would say, perhaps 10 years maximum, which was born out of the criticism towards medical humanities about how much it was focalizing the position, focalizing on the position of the doctor. So the question was, what about the others? Where is the pharmacist? Especially in my health experience in Istanbul, for instance, I first go to the pharmacist and then I go to the doctor. Probably, maybe it's not something I should be doing. But pharmacist for my grandmother's health plays such a huge role, for instance. Who talks about these things? So I think I really like that novel, İmşir, because it does show, for instance, the very fundamental role of pharmacists as well in people's lives. So that would be my answer. And the second one, yes, but of course, male body is so important in all these discussions. The working body, and also, of course, the body of the soldier when it comes to the male bodies. It is there. My excuse was that I needed to somehow narrow down my research. So I was like, okay, I'll just look at the sickly bodies of women. But we do find, of course, these formulations, especially with the image of the soldier, especially in history as well. There is great research being done in terms of how much people who were not joining the military, how they were seen by the doctors, mental illnesses wise. Also, we find Mazhar Osman talking about what people need to do in order to be good soldiers. The idea is that keep busy at all times in order to protect your health, because that is how you're going to protect your health. So it is also there, but I believe that question too also, scholars such as Egematik, who's over there, who's working on, say, masculinity studies. So that I will, I will continue with my women so far.
I can ask maybe one or two questions. One of them, when you thank you actually for your wonderful talk. You were talking about responding back. I was wondering, like when we discuss about Kerime Nader's history, can you also need it as a response to probably validated otherwise was kind of condition of dialogue they have and kind of negotiation with the early Republican period, or that happened much later? That's maybe the first question I can ask. The other one is about the maybe around you talked about bodies of exception. What about exception of Turkey or whatever? What are the global implications of this? What's happening around the world at the same time?
Thank you very much, Hocam. So in terms of Kerime Nader and the response back, I mean, it is quite interesting also because Kerime Nader, even in, for instance, when we look at Mevlut Hüküm, on the one hand, we can look at it as a rather, say, conservative novel, but on the other hand, what she does using the form, which I find quite interesting. So by turning that incredibly naturalist work into a tragedy, by making us think about, say, scenes from Othello, because there are many similarities between the two works. She's also turning into tragedy, which is of course very spiritualized. And by doing so, she's undoing her perfect image of her perfect doctor, which I find quite interesting. So she is quite conservative. So she's talking from that kind of rather dominant ideology around syphilis. But on the other hand, through form, she's also undoing what she started doing at the start as well. So she gives us a few things all at the same time. When it comes to Kerime Nadir, of course, you know, one of the known things is that, of course, she does name Handan's daughter, Nalan's daughter Handan after Hadedir's Handan, of course. So clearly, she was sort of she liked that, you know, Handan in sick chamber imagery, because we do find with her Nalan as well those, you know, rather symbolic and sad and so the kind of scenes that make us sob, as the title suggests. So there is that kind of relationship. But I do find both works, especially Posta Güvercini, not quite fighting back, kind of responding in a negative way kind of novels, but rather taking those arguments about healthy bodies of the healthy women and turning them into, and by romanticizing also tuberculosis and cancer as well. And for that, also, Posta Güvercini is really interesting, because then she creates these villains as the new money. All the rich people in Posta Güvercini are the villains of the story, who are depicted with money thirst. And our main character, who is a victim of those people, ends up developing cancer, almost as a response to that uncontrollable desire by these capitalist characters. So she is using these illnesses in order to formulate her depictions. John, what was your second question?
Global implications.
Oh, yeah. They are, it is the connection, it is that they are in communication. Many of these doctors in the 19th century too, of course, they're learning it. You know, they are students of these famous scientists in Germany, in France, in Britain even. They bring in doctors, they're reading, they are translating, they are of course producing their own texts as well. And all these ideas, of course, are a growing trend, especially, of course, in Europe. But when it comes to, for instance, something like they are interested in eugenics a lot, and they do state conferences about this. They publish works about this, and they do consider it in terms of what can we do with this? What can we learn from this? Is it useful for us? What can we do with this? But when it comes to eugenic in terms of harming people, that's when they don't like it, it seems, from in the text that I have seen, at least. However, when it comes to the idea of healthy people doing sports, producing healthy children, those ideas are very much in connection with the growing trends in many other places, such as, of course, in Germany.
I have a short question, and thank you for the talk. About the last slide, actually. I assume these are the covers of the novels that you are using in your study, or
some of them I discovered later, such as, for instance, Alev Dudaklı Kadın, which has plague in it as, again, a form of social criticism, which I didn't know, so I read it 6 months ago, so that made me very excited. So I just wanted to give a panorama of women writers' works.
my question is anyway about Hıçkırık.
Okay.
I was curious why you chose the movie
Yes.
instead of the book.
I
I mean, I have read
And
Kerime
movie
Nadir's
like-
memoirs, and she also has problems with the movie. And I was curious if you're also analyzing the movie and the book, even the theatrical version of.
I actually do not look at the movie at all in my research. I do not. It's just I really like that film. That's why it's there. But no, I mean it could be done, especially its popularity. I think these are really important, and also the two versions. What happens in the two adaptations as well? But that would then lead me to some other discussion as well. So I'll stop there. But I do find all these and the changes as well. I find quite interesting. The ending. How the frame narrative is completely removed in the movie, which of course the frame narrative in the novel is the thing again, the form again gives us what Kelime Nadir is doing there in the novel as creating this love story, again, read by a retired soldier as well. So again, very much read by, like some sort of narrative about these old times, the time of nation building. So yeah, but I just put the pictures because I know something.
I know this looks flat, but we are friends, obviously. Thank you for this talk. My question is not about the talk and about your following, but because I think people will be interested. I know what you're working on now. Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Yes, thank you. This question really wasn't planned, so I just would like to announce that. Yeah, so currently I started also I started to feel very much interested in from medicine. I started with medicine. I now would like to move on to science and say things like the use of telephone, the use of cars, the approach towards planes, and how we find them in literature as well, and how they understand, how they kind of, whether they have affected the self-orientation, understandings of time and space and distance, and whether this has affected, and whether we see these in these works as well. So that is right now where my head is going towards. But in relation to that, I'm also interested in something that's not related to Turkish literature as well, which is the use of the new ways of communication, such as WhatsApp, such as use of Twitter, and how now novels, contemporary novels, are using them, because that too, something like a WhatsApp message makes me accessible at all times. And that completely changes my self-orientation about where I am, about where that X person is. It is immediate. It's not like writing a letter. I send it to you and I know you have seen it, respond to me, right? You're thinking about these things. So I'm also quite interested in how new works, such as some examples like Elif Batuman's works, for instance, some examples for that. Little Scratch Bar, Emma Watson does that using scrolling, and how much she uses it as a new type of stream of consciousness, because we are constantly distracted by technology. So that is also where this technology project is also leading towards as well. So somehow I'll figure it out whether it is doable or not. Thank you.
I can ask a follow-up question, actually, which I was thinking about. So especially your reference to using novels, but not for like seeking realism or reality, or digging for reality. But I was thinking also about İmşir abla, and it is I mean, on the one hand, it is very realistic to the sense that it hurts. It can be possible, but you use novels and literature for a history of modernity and modernization. So maybe you can talk a little about how on the ways we can use or utilize literature, or how would this project be different, for instance, if you were to write the same cultural history or same social history by using another set of sources? What did novels or women writers contribute to this project?
It was what I was interested in, how they were, because, for instance, when we of course think about tuberculosis, it is a very nasty disease. It is you lose a lot of your skin gets paler and paler. You start bleeding quite a lot. You stink, right? There's a bad smell that comes with tuberculosis, which really doesn't fit with, how, for instance, Hülya Koçyiğit is depicted in that film, right? No one pretends to be disturbed by the smell whatsoever. So that romanticization, how literature and the culture products are capable of taking something that actually just, it's a horrible disease, it needs to be treated, there's nothing romantic about it, to this, mythology about it. And of course, we find it in, say, the similar mythologies in romantic poets as well, in the Romanticism movement, all this, I'm a genius, therefore I'm so sensitive that therefore I have this disease. How does that bridge work? How do we go from this rather bad disease to this romantic imagery that people, I think it was Lord Byron who was also jealous of people with tuberculosis. I might be wrong, I'll check this. I think there's a line from him that says, I don't look like one, therefore that no one takes me seriously. So how do you have that? And also in the 19th century, again, for instance, in Britain, it becomes a fashion. Women especially try to lose weight and make their cheeks look redder so that they seem as if they have tuberculosis. So how do we come from, this really deadly disease to wanting to look like a person who has the disease? So that I find in literature is of course capable of utilizing these, instrumentalizing these, but also it is capable of undoing these things or all at the same time. So that is where the literature in my research comes onto stage.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask a question, but just a personal remark. When I had working parents when I was growing up, and so I spent a lot of time in front of Yeşilçam movies. And I remember, of course, watching İmşir, and and this is very, I'm going to take this home and think about this from a personal history perspective. I had this personal game when I was like 8. I would pretend to be, I think, Yakochit and several other Yeşilçam stars, and I would like be ill. So, I had this like child game by myself of pretending to be a sickly, beautiful woman. Now I will take that to a therapist, but the rest of it. But I think this does say something about constructing oneself as an object of fantasy and constructing, because it's maybe it relates to Ipek's question as how does this become an object of fantasy, and how does sickness become an object of fantasy, and how is sickness sexualized? And so that's, I think, is very interesting in that I don't know what you could say about that. A second question would be, and how as a child, since this was happening to me as a child, apparently, how do people how is this different when it's a child's body that's ill, or when a child's body is represented as weak? And we remember from figures like Sezercik and poverty and illness, and how does that play into our understanding of the nation?
So with the first question, that fantasized, sexualized object of, on the one hand, of course, I used to do the same as well, by the way. So can I come to the therapy? Therapy. On the one hand, of course, there is that imagery about being sick and about being ill that, I think we go back to that, for instance, parenthesis time or the excuse. If I say, sorry, I won't be able to do the talk on Monday because I am hospitalized, then no one will say, how dare you? I mean, I'm assuming. Because, that idea of illness also gives us, we are now in that time of exception. We are now this other person that we cannot take. So we become fragile. We expect people to be nice to us. Which Susan Sontag, I can't remember the exact words now, but of course in illness as metaphor, she then therefore discusses illness as this other world, right? We belong to this other world where these expectations are not quite put on to us anymore. But in terms of sexualization, that passive, I think it's also, we can connect it to say the imagery of the sleeping princess in fairy tales, again, passive, controllable, not active, like the woman in Bram Stoker's Dracula, for instance, right? When they are turning into vampires, they're first having that tuberculosis look on them, and then they become dangerous because then they become sexy, and therefore, they should be staked or something. So there is that kind of like gender dynamics playing in there in terms of making women passive and in need of help, and damsel in distresses in that damsels in distress in that regard. Does that respond? And child's body, for instance, in Mevtukum, there's actually a child who dies, although I can't remember his name now. But as soon as Kasım Şinasi sees him, he defines him as a sickly child. So it's as if the child is kind of representing, he was from the get-go like a hereditary thing. From the get-go, he was an unhealthy boy. And this boy is from the upper class. Dan Kalfin Shinasi goes to rather poor neighborhoods and treats people for free. And then her class criticism comes onto stage this time. And she then, the narrator rather, then starts blaming the conditions, the lack of education in people, and how, of course, men, even if they don't have any money to say, go out and be unfaithful and drink rakı in Beyoğlu, they are apparently still, say, capable of spending their money on tobacco rather than buying food, good food for their children. So she actually does use the image of the sick child in there. So in the examples that I have encountered, sick child is usually connected to the idea of hereditary, because then there's nothing you can kind of do about it. But of course, in other examples, then, you know, depending on the child's age, then it is romanticized or not romanticized. Fragile child, genius child, sensitive child, all of these kind of definitions are used for the image of the sickly child in the examples that I have encountered.
We have one question from Zoom by Marve Shen. She thanks for sharing this exciting work. And the question is, could you elaborate on the concept of care more, especially you're touching upon caring about ourselves in İmşir Abla is quite significant, which is a novel almost reconfigures self-care in neoliberal age. So do you recognize a shift or different modalities in the idea of care in Turkish modernity through literature?
In especially in İmşir Abla, of course, in there, one of the things that comes on stage is, I'll start with, thank you very much, Marve, for this great question. I'll actually start with a rather personal thing. When I submitted my book proposal to the publishing house, I hope they're, they never see this presentation, but one of the requests by them was that I connected it to, they wanted me to connect the entire discussion to COVID. Which then, of course, would mean another book. So I then, instead of writing a conclusion, I then try to protect myself from it by writing an epilogue, which means conclusion, but doesn't matter. So I very, very fast, in a fast manner, I sort of mentioned a few novels and try to understand what they were doing. But one of the turns, of course, what's happening after the 1990s is the neoliberal turn in the medicine, of course, which we find, say, in the works of scholars such as Ayşe Can Terzioğlu, the idea that, you start investing in your health, go and do your yearly checkups, go and do your whatever other things that we do, when we go to private hospitals and, self-care, parts of, it is the package that we are now getting from the, of course, hospitals. So that's where it comes onto stage, in my opinion, if that gives an answer to Marve's great question. Thank you much, Marve. Again, I don't know why the camera is, but I'm just
Any other questions?
I can ask another question, Ayman. I was looking at the picture of the covers, it's pretty diverse, and my students have heard this from me so many times, but what does this picture say about the Turkish novel in general? When we look at, from the perspective of, medicine and, especially not just in terms of the issue, but also the formal elements of, Turkish novel. Have you thought about it?
I think one worry I had was, of course, when I was preparing the research, was how much of a broad timeline I was using. But then again, I was so curious about the change after the coups, because then, of course, as Jayla just said, the break about the body there is so obvious and it's so different. And of course, in, say, works such in writers' works such as, say, Sevin Burak, Afrika Dansı being an example, form too undoes what is happening. Or I love Çocukluğun Soğuk Geceleri so much, because apparently why I was quoting it so much, and I needed to get rid of all my quotations so that I wouldn't pay copyrights to the publishing house. But it is so interesting how the narrator there is using the body as its method of opening up to the world, the tactile, the sense of the touch, is there. So therefore, that is something that interrupts constantly the kind of traditional narrative that is going on in there. The similar thing happens, of course, in something like Africa dancer as well. When we go to say Aslı Erdoğan, we find something else. What I found, to answer the question in a clearer way, what I was not expecting and what I found on the way was how these different genres were choosing different illnesses. That I found quite interesting. Because, of course, something like syphilis is easier say than tuberculosis in order to produce a commentary about society in general. Because just by using syphilis, I can blame so many people. Whereas with tuberculosis, I can do a completely different, a very melodramatic romanticization. So that I wasn't quite expecting. And also, of course, after the coup, how body becomes something that is tangible and that undoes the body in this discourse, that perfect body that does not get sick. If it gets sick, we need to leave it behind, and we are now moving towards the new kind of body, like we find, we say, in Tatarcık, for instance.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the audience?
It is they apparently published it as a just the short story by Aslı Erdoğan in one sort of book format as well. So it is that.
Other questions, and maybe in Turkish that I can quickly translate?
Ben sormayacağım yani.
Yok, ben söyle. I mean, we have read İlker abla in PKL 201 this year, so I was expecting more questions in that regard, but there seems to be none. Okay. Oh, yes, there is one.
Thanks for the presentation. I wonder the relation between being oldness, elderly, and the appreciation of being elderly as a illnesses. Recently, there are lots of medical products on explaining the manifestation of being elderly, and actually there is no distinct relationship between that and the elderly. Being the elderly does not mean that we will not die, and we will die eventually, but people try to delay the elderly. And the only one, I think, the only one who wins this process is the medical product owners, and everyone will die. Will be all there, unfortunately. And I wonder, can we keep track of this thing in the literature? Can we see it in literature in this journal?
Of course, being getting older, we do also discuss this in my class bodies in literature as well. And I always find it quite interesting because I then realize my students never actually think about ageism as a problem or the representations of aging. And we always start from these anti-aging creeds, stop the aging, do not get older. Or there was it's a news article about Hilary Duff, I think, and the article was something like, look at the pictures of Hilary Duff being so hot still at the age of 35. Which offends me because I'm 36. So, aging studies, thankfully, is now the field that is looking at what you have just described. And of course, we do find, again, rather problematic, and we never think about, I think, as a society, as societies rather, as being an ageist, doing ageism is actually a problematic thing. Not hiring people over certain ages or using phrases such as, what was that famous phrase? Silver storm, I think, or silver hurricane or something. The ideas about the aged population is growing so much and we should be afraid of it. We should now panic about it. And this is part of the cultural imagination. It is there. And we are bombarded with these these kind of metaphors more and more and more, not just making us fear our own aging, but also society as a society as well, as if aging people are our enemies, as if aging is our enemy, which is obviously very, very problematic. Right now, in relation to Turkish literature, for instance, one novel that immediately comes to my mind is Son Adım is one. And another work, other works would be probably Margaret Atwood writes about this, Alice Munro also writes about this. So we find these rather various portrayals of aging in these different kinds of writings, but it is definitely there. And it is something that's, again, we find in literary imagination. I think not as often as we should find, but it is there, definitely.
Any other questions? I have one more question that is kind of an addendum to, I mean, what I had in mind while listening to other questions, actually. For instance, the sick male body or the sick elderly body, are they represented in a way that are more effeminate, more feminine? Because we have this very sickly female image is very central. So, and after your talk and the questions, I had the feeling that anybody that is sick or old or somehow marginalized, that is not central, is closer to be feminine. Is it my kind of feeling, or is there such a tendency of making the sick body as female or effeminate?
In terms of with pictures of, I'm going to need a second in order to think about from whether there are any, for instance, portrayals of elderly characters in the works that I specifically looked at, and I don't think there were any. But there are, of course, various different representations in that. For instance, the male body as an aging body, feminization is one, and I think, do you discuss this in your thesis? You do discuss it in your thesis. But also getting wiser as well is one of the imageries that we find in there, even in popular literature as well, such as, I don't know, examples from Lord of the Rings to, I don't know, Harry Potter. This wise old man is this image that we find in a way that we don't often find about women who are getting older, because then they are kind of represented as in a negative light, more in a negative light in popular culture compared to the other way around, starting from, for instance, from fairy tales with the evil queens. Would that answer the question too?
I mean, I have further questions, but not necessarily within the realms of this talk, but more on the gender sense.
Can I just say something about it? It seems like also the difference that you just mentioned is also about fertility, because we have this link between male fertility and aging that we don't necessarily have with male fertility and aging.
Mm-hmm.
So an aging man is still fertile, which means powerful.
Yeah.
And an aging woman is sort of like a body of exception, so much more easily in the very biological aspect of fertility, maybe.
That's actually, yes, definitely. And thank you so much for reminding me that I hadn't actually thought about that. And one image, for instance, that comes to my mind is, if I'm not wrong, Kerime Nadir's, again, Dehşet Gecesi. I think there is that kind of a little bit of discussion there about fertility and using the fertility and what that makes you. But yeah, definitely, it was a connection that I actually hadn't thought about just now. But yeah, 100%. Which is the kind of imagery, again, we find after a certain age, then what are you doing? Or is it that the time concept as well is another, I think, question that we can talk about.
And what is your use for the nation? If
you are not, yeah. For instance, in the some scientific writings, some doctors are saying, if you are going to work, if you want to have a job, then just don't bother giving birth, because you are using your energy and your body in something else. So do not, do the second thing. So in some doctors' writings, like Masar Osman, we do find that if you're doing one, don't do the other thing, because then, you cannot focus on your children. You cannot focus on making them healthy children in the future. So that fertility is 100% there. Again, it goes back to that, question. If someone is telling me that I should have I should have 3 children, and then if putting aside my political position, my choices and everything else, what if simply I'm not capable of doing that? Then what happens? Then what does that say to me? I think that we go down.
Were there any women writing about this kind of stuff?
Pardon?
Were there any women writing about this, like, Masar Osman? Like, when we're talking about the context,
Yeah.
they create this context. Any women contributing this context?
That is a very, very good question hocam. Teşekkür ederim. For instance, I should say that Sarah Aktik does. Yes, there are. In forms of PhD theses as well. There are. I cannot remember the names of the works at the moment, but yes, definitely there are that are talking about all this. And in terms of children, also they do consider for a while as well. One of the things that they're discussing quite widely is paying money to people. Paying more salary or giving them encouragement when they have children. More children, the more money. Or can we penalize the ones who are not giving birth? So all of these discussions are there at the forefront.
We have one more question from our online audience. Imran Gökçe Şahin, thanks you for your informing presentation. And the question is, your work focuses on illness, but I wanted to know whether there are similar portrayals for disabled bodies. Blindness, for instance, a popular theme for Yeşilçam movies. Is disability something seen as illness, especially in relation to the ideas around healthy and sturdy bodies are often aged?
Thank you very much, Gökçe, and hello to you. Yes and no. Disability studies, in terms of how it is represented and how it is dealt with, they do go on quite similar routes, but quite different as well. The thing with illness, of course, is the idea that the thing about illness is that in terms of cultural representations, we do find that the idea of cure isn't there, for instance, and the idea of hereditary, for instance, is something that we find more aligned with the disability, more at the center of the disability studies, as well as a discussion in terms of representations of it, especially in the 19th century, if that does make sense.
Any other questions from the audience? Yes.
Thank you so much for the talk, Shima. It was very informative and intriguing. I wonder if film writers are inclined to use some specific types of diseases in order to construct their illnesses in the text. I mean, they mostly refer to some kind of biological illnesses or neurological illnesses or mental illnesses. Do we see some kind of information? There's a change about it? And if yes, do you think if it does say something about women's writing in terms of soul and body dichotomy?
I think it depends, of course, the writer and the work. But the trouble is, of course, when, for instance, when we come to say something like mental illnesses, the kind of the uses there and the kind of rather the discussion is going to be would then be I deliberately, when I first started thinking about this research, mental illnesses were also there. But then I immediately realized if I'm going to focus on the bodies, that's going to be something quite different than, say, mental illnesses and how they are depicted. So that's I think it's it depends on the writer. I mean, someone like, say, how they find the depictions of both, for instance. But despite her talking about and using both, still the image of health and unhealthiness, the question is still there. So both are there in her writing. But with mental illness, that would take the topic and the discussion to somewhere else. So I sort of stopped myself from getting there. I was specifically interested in what happens to the body and the physical and the material and the flesh. That makes sense.
Thank you for your talk. That was great, really. And I would like to ask that, did you come across an example of mental illness combined with body illness? For instance, when it comes to motherhood, there is postnatal syndrome, so it's both connected to mental illness and body at the same time. And did you have an example of it? Because women who have postnatal syndrome show very dangerous implications, and it becomes a national problem, almost state problem, and the law, Turkish law, had to intervene this case, and it says if a woman is mentally sick, so she is not responsible for killing her children after giving birth. How is the situation in this small after giving birth and becoming a mother?
Giving birth and becoming a mother. If you're going to talk about the taking something that it both affects the mental health as well as the physical health. For instance, syphilis does that. It starts affecting the mental health as well. And that is one of the discussions in the novel as well. Also going back to Seda, your question again, I do of course use Teze Özlü in the book. And of course in Teze Özlü, we do not have a physical illness. However, the reason that was really rather complete in something in the research, and it was the use of the body, the physical body, the very forefront position of the body in there. Now, going back to pregnancy, let me think about it. Can I need to think about it to think of examples about it. But if I can get your details afterwards, I'm more than happy to communicate with you afterwards and send you whatever I think of if they are useful at all for you.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you.
I am a bit wondering about the scope of your research. What will be the result if you choose a female illness instead of those illnesses like tuberculosis or cancer, which are not unexpected because we're living? What if you choose something like vaginismus or, I mean, obviously menstruation is not a disease, but extreme pain. And I would like to know a bit about the Turkish literature, how it approaches to that kind of.
That is a very, very good question because I mean I think that is a wonderful project, isn't it?
Yeah.
It is great, and you know.
Hepsini sizden istiyoruz.
I mean that's a very good question. You know, there is, you know, why are we not talking about these things more often? There is HPV. You know, why are we not, you know, talking about HPV in, I don't know, in even like, I don't know, the TV series such as Sex and the City. But why is there no mentioning of any of these things? Well, where are they? You know, menopause, we do find, you know, suggestions, perhaps references. I even remember actually asking my dad what menopause was when I was reading. I was, I think, 7 or something, and I was reading Bir Genç Kızın Gizli Defteri by İpek Kongu. And the first line, I remember this very clearly because the first line was, my mom is so annoying. I think she's going through menopause. The main girl was writing to her diary. And I remember asking my dad, what is menopause? And he was trying to explain to me what menopause was, which had really confused me. But yeah, why don't we, you know, talk about these things more often, especially vaginismus, especially HPV? You know, yeah, I think that's a, you know, a great question and a very wonderful project. If you, I don't know, would like to embark on that, I think that would be very excellent.
Any other questions? Let me again update the online questions. Are there any new ones? So thank you very much for this intriguing talk and discussion, and thank you all for your contributions. We will continue with our Monday talks on May the 8th with Michael Pfeiffer's book Kindred Voices about 14th century Anatolia, and we'd like to have you all also there. Thank you so much again, and thank you all for me.